Hello there. We begin our survey of modern theology with philosophy. Today we're going to study some of the philosophical influences that ended up becoming an influence on modern theology because these philosophers asked particular questions that demanded answers and theologians had to answer them. And this would change the very nature of the discipline of theology. As you can see, we start out in 1800 and we end in 1850. This is kind of the early modern period, and so we're going to look at the influences on that early modern period, what got it started, what moved it in a particular direction that will influence the rest of this course. Today I want to talk about three philosophers, a guy named David Hume, a guy named Immanuel Kant, and a guy named George Frederick Hegel. Each of these was immensely important in asking questions that theologians would feel like they needed to answer. So that's where we're headed. Let's talk first about Hume and see what his influence was. Now, Hume was, first of all, a skeptic. And that's his legacy as a philosopher. He asked questions, can you really know? Can you really be as sure about knowledge as Enlightenment thinkers had thought that they were? For us, the importance of David Hume is that he breaks the law of causation. And in so doing, he dismisses God as a first cause. Most theologians during the Enlightenment were set on saying that God is a first cause. God is that unmoved mover through whom all things come. And of course, Christians all hold that. And Hume is set on showing that that is less reliable and less rational than we actually had thought. A number of theologians were trying to show through the arguments of design that this was a very rational thing to hold. And Hume says, wait a minute, it is not so self-evidently rational. For Hume, to get there, all reasoning concerning matter of fact seems to be founded on the relation of cause to effect. Now, Hume is correct about this. All scientific knowledge seems to move from cause to effect. In other words, we see the effects, scientists see the effects in nature, and they reason toward a cause. What was the cause of that? And that's the way the scientific field works. Causes viruses to be infectious? What causes nature to exist as it does? These are the kinds of questions that scientists ask. What Hume does is he says it's not self-evident to move back to causes. So what Hume is saying is this: we can't be absolutely sure when we see an effect that there's a particular cause. There may be certain patterns that look very regular, and we can assume that that's the case, but we don't know. And we can really never know unless something is so absolutely regular that we have no other explanation for it. So for Hume, from causes which appear similar, we expect similar effects. And this is really all of our experimental conclusions. That's what we have to base results on. We can't know anything purely and simply. We can't have any known facts about the world. All we have is a collection of the scientific data that we've pulled together. This sounds obvious to us today because Hume showed it to be obvious, but in Hume's day, there was a grander confidence that certain things were simply the case. So from this expectation, we infer the reality of something called causation, but Hume says we never really experience causation. All we experience is that B always follows A. How can we make that step toward causation? Now, what Hume is really getting at here for the purposes of our course is, okay, what about causes that can't be seen? And what about claiming with some kind of confidence that God is the first cause of things? Hume says if you just look around the universe, those design arguments that call for the grandeur of a single God creating all things just don't work. Look around the universe. What an immense profusion of beings, animated and organized, sensible and active. You admire this prodigious variety and fecundity, but inspect a little more narrowly. These living existences, the only beings worth regarding, just take a look. How hostile and destructive they are to each other. And Hume says it's much more reasonable to think that nature just runs by blind chance. So for Hume, what he's trying to do is say that theologians who argue from creation, or the world as we see it now, back to some kind of a perfect or single God, that's simply ridiculous. One can't do that with any measure of confidence. For example, the idea that God is perfect, theologians would say. But how do we affirm that from the world that we see? Isn't there all kinds of chaos in the world? You would think that God would have done a little better if he was a perfect God. Maybe, Hume says, this was a really young God, and he didn't know what he was doing. Maybe it was God's first experiment, and he tried, and he got it all wrong, and then he tried again somewhere else and did better. You can't say that this was the perfect result of a perfect God. Rather, it looks somewhat otherwise. So you can't say that God is perfect by looking at nature, Hume says. Nor can you, Hume says, say that God is one. Of course, this is what the monotheistic religions affirm, but Hume says, why does nature show that? Couldn't there have been 2 or 3 gods? Couldn't this have been just one of the gods trying an experiment, and then the other gods are doing something else? Maybe one god tried to work in the world and another god messed it up. So we can't, just looking at nature, say that God is one. So Hume breaks our confidence in these kinds of things. And he says we have to affirm that it's a faith stance, but then affirm that it's not a very reasonable one, and there are plenty of other good explanations for things. Now, Hume will also talk about miracles in this way, and I think the way that he proceeds with miracles is very instructive for how Hume operates. So let's go to that topic next. What Hume wants to say is that miracles are impossible. And if miracles are impossible, Christianity has to be an unreasonable religion. So upon the whole, he says, we may conclude that the Christian religion was not only at first attended with miracles, but even at this day cannot be believed by any reasonable person without also believing in miracles. Mere reason, he says, is insufficient to convince us of this truth. He's going to say, in fact, it's unreasonable to believe in miracles. If Christianity requires miracles to be believed in, then Christianity is an unreasonable religion, and anyone who's reasonable should move on. Let's see how he develops his argument. Hume is a very good empiricist, and that means that he believes that sense experience, as we've already seen, is the only way to get good information about the world. In fact, any kind of information about the world has to come through sense experience. Diligent observation, scientific inquiry, looking at and investigating things with the 5 senses. If I can't get to it with my 5 senses, then I have no right to claim that it's true. So Hume says we have a variety of data in the world. Some things are absolutely constant. We call these laws. These are scientific laws because they happen without exception. Not everything happens in that way. Some things are variable. Sometimes we see this effect in nature, sometimes that. And we can't call it a scientific law because there's change here. Sometimes, and Hume will call these marvels, we see things that are very unlikely happen in nature. For example, a plane crash happens, all 200 people on board die except for one little child. And that's very unlikely. But there's a scientific explanation. On the other end of the spectrum, Hume would say, there are things then that constantly never happen. And Hume will define these as miracles. If they constantly never happen in the world of scientific experiment, then Hume says they're impossible. Let's see how he gets there. So Hume wants to distinguish, point 2 here, between marvels and miracles. Marvels have a scientific explanation, or could be at least scientifically explained. but they're highly unlikely. So the plane crashes, all persons on board, all 200 of them die, except for one child. A believer might say, that's a miracle. But Hume would say, no, it's just a fortunate thing that child was just in the right place at the right time and somehow survived that plane crash. There's a perfectly good scientific explanation for it, even if we can't exactly see it. On the other hand, there are certain things called miracles that are violations of the law of nature. One of those might be resurrection from the dead. No one ever rises from the dead. Christian faith depends on resurrection from the dead, and so we can conclude that Christian faith is unreasonable, because that resurrection event is a violation of the law of nature. It doesn't happen, and therefore it didn't happen, Hume is going to say. So, look at point 3 then. By definition, miracles are impossible. By definition. There must be, Hume says, uniform experience against every miraculous event, or it wouldn't be a miracle. That's because miracle is something that never happens. It's something that all the evidence goes against. So, Hume says, then, no testimony in the world could ever make a miracle seem credible. If it's of the kind of thing that can never happen, or never reasonably be said to happen, then nobody's testimony could make it reasonable. So we hear somebody saying that Jesus rose from the dead, big deal. People don't rise from the dead. That's what our uniform experience tells us, so it didn't happen. And we can know that that testimony sounds to the scientific community or to any reasonable person to be rather foolish. According to Hume, then, we don't even need to look at the evidence. If somebody is giving a testimony saying that somebody rose from the dead, Hume says we don't even need to look at the evidence for that. There's 100% chance that people don't rise from the dead, so we don't need to listen to the testimony of someone saying it happened. No matter how strong the evidence may be, and here we could bring in proofs for the resurrection of Jesus that some evangelicals have developed, Hume says now, we have full proof against the existence of any miracle. We don't even have to consider that kind of evidence. Miracles are impossible because they break laws of nature. And as uniform experience amounts to a proof, there is direct and full proof against the existence of any miracle. That's Hume's argument here. Now, you may see some problems in it. Let me give C.S. Lewis's response, and that will help us to see better what Hume is doing here. About 150 years later, C.S. Lewis gave a somewhat famous and I think helpful response to Hume. C.S. Lewis says, wait a minute, David Hume. Your argument, to start out with, is circular. After all, if you say that a miracle, proof against a miracle is developed on unanimous testimony, then we shouldn't immediately count out those kinds of miracle claims because we have testimony that they happened. So that's Lewis's first argument here. The second one is a bit more interesting. That is that Hume's definition of a miracle is simply wrong. A miracle is not something that breaks a law of nature. What Lewis is going to say is it's something that adds from the outside to nature, and the laws of nature continue. Let's consider a fishbowl. Let's say that this fish has existed for years as a fish in this bowl. He knows everything about the bowl. He knows all the laws of how the bowl works. And yet one day, the owner drops some kind of a toy into the fishbowl. Fish doesn't see it come in, and suddenly a toy is there. Now the fish may think, impossible. That breaks the law of nature. But it didn't. It's simply that the fish can't see that there's an outside agent acting on the fishbowl, acting from outside on the laws of nature that go on inside the fishbowl. the owner didn't change any of the laws of nature. He simply added something to the fishbowl, and all the natural laws keep working as they did before. So, in the case of the feeding of the 5,000, God simply inserts more food where there wasn't any before. In the case of a resurrection, God inserts life where there was a dead corpse. In the case of the virgin birth, God inserts life into the womb of a woman, and all of the laws of nature proceed as they always have. In fact, take the example of the virgin birth. That's precisely why there was a birth, because all the laws of nature proceed exactly as God intended them to, exactly as they always had, says Lewis. Or let's take the example of money. Let's say we put some rupees down on a counter and came back the next day and those rupees were gone. Your immediate thought would not be, the laws of nature have been broken. Instead, your immediate thought would probably be that the laws of India had been broken. Someone, an outside agent, had acted on those rupees and had taken them for themselves. Here it's perfectly reasonable to think there are two possibilities. One, a law of nature could be broken, but that's unlikely. More likely, an outside agent acted on these rupees. And so, Lewis says, unless you can prove that there's no outside agent, then you can't prove that the law of nature had been broken. So let's sum it up then. A miracle is an insertion of something into our natural order by an outside agent, Lewis says. The problem with Hume is that his definition of miracle is wrong. Nothing in the natural order is broken or violated. No laws of nature are somehow stopped or changed or broken in any way. God simply adds something as an outside agent into our system, and the laws of nature continue to work just as they always had. What Hume would need to do, Lewis says, in order to prove that Christianity was unreasonable, is to prove that there was absolutely no outside agent, which is to prove that all that there is to reality is what we see inside the fishbowl, and there's absolutely nothing outside of it. If that can be proven, then Lewis says you have a good argument. Until that can be proven, you're simply begging the question. Now, I bring that in to show how Hume operates. He's confident that human reason is an empirical data, that is, that which can be gained through the senses, is the way in which we know things. It's the only way in which we know things. That's going to be a confident assertion of many of the early modernists, and it's going to be picked up by theologians and skeptics alike. Now, as you can see, Hume's objections are actually answerable, and a number of persons have answered them quite well. The greatest achievement of Hume was to lead to Immanuel Kant, because he got Kant, a Prussian living somewhere between Germany and Poland, to begin thinking. Hume's problem was that we could not make a logical connection or a self-evident connection between cause and effect. We could see it happen a lot of different times, and so it was a reasonable kind of a step. But could we really prove cause to effect? That is, could the scientific enterprise really achieve anything with proof? Kant wants to show that cause and effect are intricately linked. He does it in a different kind of a way. Now, Kant is absolutely important for modern theology, and what we're going to see is that he has influenced your life more than about anybody else since the time of Jesus Christ. Kant is immensely important for the way that we think today as modern persons about philosophy, about life, and about theology. So let's see what Kant is up to. Now, Kant recognizes that the best way to get our knowledge of things is through the senses. It comes through empiricism, he says. That is what we can access with our five senses. Things that I can see, things that I can hear, things that I can touch, things that I can smell. These kinds of things are the things that I can know. Okay? But Kant wants to ask, how do I know that I'm really knowing those things in themselves? After all, aren't what I'm doing really collecting data through my senses? And doesn't my senses somehow process that data in a certain way so that I don't know if I'm really getting at reality as it is? Well, the only thing I can know is what I've gotten with my senses. Kant suggests then that the mind is an active, productive machine. What it does is it takes what our senses do and it organizes it. It processes it in a certain way, and that's, in the end, what we know. That's what we actually understand. Is that the way the world really is out there? Or is it just what my understanding of the world is taking in? How do I know that I'm really experiencing the world the way it is? Kant says we can't know that, pun intended there. Kant says we simply cannot know the way the world is in itself. So whatever is going on over here with the way the world really is, I absolutely can't know that. The only thing I can know is what my senses can get a hold of, and that is the world according to my senses. That's the only thing that I can know with any confidence. What I can infer, though, is that my mind actively processes that data and shapes it in a certain way that it's accessible to me. What I can get is the way the world is processed through my brain. Now, Kant has special terms for this. He calls that phenomena. That is, what I can touch, what I can see, what I can smell, that's phenomena. Those are things in the world that have been processed through my brain, and I can know those things. So we can reach the phenomena of the world. All of us can look around the world, and our senses become active. We're getting information about the world. What Kant says we can't know is the noumena, things as they are in themselves, because our brain always processes the information for us. It shapes it in a certain way that we get it, and we can't get it in any other way, Kant says. So how can we actually know the way things really are? Well, we can't. So the mind should be thought of not as an inert receiver, but as something that receives and produces. It shapes and forms raw data of the five senses into knowledge using innate cognitive functions that Kant calls, two things here, forms of intuition and categories of understanding. Both of these are really interesting. Let's just simplify it for today. The forms of intuition are space and time. Now, you'll notice in our universe, human creatures are constructed with an ability to catch one dimension of time. Time always moves from past to present to future. That's the way time works for us. It's always linear. It always moves from past to future. The other thing that is a form of intuition is space. We always process things in 3 dimensions of space. There is up, down, there's back, forward, there's right, left. Those are our 3 dimensions of space. String theorists tell us that there are perhaps 11 different dimensions in our universe, and 7 of those then are inaccessible to our senses. We simply can't get at them because we see a 4-dimensional universe, 1 dimension of time and 3 dimensions of space. Kant says those are our forms of intuition. That's the way the world is processed for us. Do I really know there's only 1 dimension of time? Do I really know there's only 3 dimensions of space? Of course not. In fact, string theorists tell us there are probably more. But in our world, the way that our minds process things, it's always in those dimensions. So those are the forms of intuition. And then there are categories of understanding. Now, there are a number of categories here. The one that's important for us is causation. We see things in terms of causation. A causes B. So that's Kant's response to Hume. Can I know that things happen from A to B? Can I know causation happens? Well, yes, because my mind processes it that way. Always our mind processes it that way. And so I can have confidence in causation because my mind processes that way. And so science can move on, can make valid discoveries and tell us about the world. Of course, we are only accessing the phenomena here. We don't know the world as it really is. But always, our minds are going to give us causation, cause and effect, and so we can always know that we're going to process the phenomena of the world in terms of cause and effect. Now, Kant actually thinks he's going to confidently bring God back into the picture here. It would seem that if we can't know the world in itself, then we would have no understanding of God. But Kant thinks that both the world in itself and God are reasonable propositions. Let's go through his argument. Point one, we can't know beyond what our senses collect and our minds process. We can't know the real in itself. We can only know the phenomena that we access through the processing of our minds. Interestingly then, I can't know that I have free will, but I couldn't live my life unless I assume that I do somehow. I can't know that there is some ground of all reality, say God, but Kant says I can't really live my life unless I assume that there is some ground of all reality. So even if I can't know these things, I must postulate these things in order to even use my reason. If I didn't assume there was a ground of reality, I couldn't really use my reason. If I didn't assume that I'm having free will in using my reason, that I'm freely reasoning, then I couldn't reason. And if I didn't assume that there was a real out there, then I couldn't use my reason. So Kant says we have to postulate these things, even though we can't know them, that is, get them directly, because it's processed through our minds, and so we can't get at those realities directly. So I must postulate that God exists, even if I don't know that God exists. Now here's where Kant becomes even more interesting and actually a little bit more difficult. Kant says there are certain things of metaphysical reason that we must postulate, and certain things of moral reason that we must postulate. So I must postulate certain regulative ideas in order for my reason to even work. I must say that there's a real out there, even though I can't access it directly. I must say that there's a ground of all existence, that is God, even though I can't access it directly. I must say there's free will, even though I can't access it directly. Okay, so there must be a first cause. There must be a ground of all possibilities. Therefore, it's reasonable and inescapable, Kant wants to say, to postulate the existence of God. Even though we can't say anything about what God is like, God must be there as a ground of all existence, or else I wouldn't have confidence for anything else. Leave that for a moment. Let's move over to moral reason. I must postulate certain regulative ideas in order for my morality to work. I must hold that there is a universal law out there of good and of bad in order to act into what is good. Kant calls this the categorical imperative. This is his categorical imperative. It sounds a lot like Jesus's law here, to always act in such a way that the principle of the act is one that can be universalized. Think of Jesus here. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's basically what Kant is getting at here. He thought that was an achievement of morality by Jesus, the categorical imperative, to always act in such a way that the principle of the act is one that can be universalized. Should I ever lie? Well, no. If I were to lie, then Other people could lie, and if everyone were to lie, then society would break down. We don't want society to break down. Society is built on trust and honesty, so therefore I should never lie. That's Kant's idea. But Kant has a problem. He says, I know from experience that what I ought to do and what makes me happy don't always correspond. Sometimes I tell the truth and bad things happen to me as a result. Bad things happen to good people for being good all the time. And so Kant wants to say there has to be something more in order to make sure that the categorical imperative is well-founded. So Kant says here again, it's reasonable to assume God. God must make a final destiny where virtue and happiness correspond. If I'm to keep the categorical imperative and really hold to that, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, then I have to assume that God is going to make everything right in the end. If I can't assume that God is going to make everything right in the end, then why would I do something to others? Because they might not do something good to me. So Kant says we can assume that there is a perfect God who's going to make everything right. So I must think of a God in order to bind myself to the universal moral law. That's Kant's argument here. Now let's see what this argument achieves. Kant has promised that he's going to make God reasonable again. He's going to show that there's a definite, important ground for God's existence. It doesn't seem to me that Kant was a very religious person, as we'll see in just a moment, but Kant says that there's a firm foundation for belief in God, and he wants to make that reasonable. He shows it to be the case, he thinks, by saying it's a necessary postulate in order for reason to work, in order for moral reasoning to work, and therefore God must exist if anything else is to happen in the world. But wait a minute, there are some deep concerns here. For one, why is it all that rational to postulate God when we have no empirical evidence of God? We could ask that question. It looks suspiciously like Kant is inventing something to hold his whole system in place. It's God that brings everything together for Kant, ultimately, the ground of existence, the ground of morality, the one who makes things right in the end. But if we can't see that, then is it just to prop up Kant's philosophical system? Is that the only need for God that we really have for Kant? Secondly, and this may be closer to the problem that a religious person would understand, is in Kant's model, there is no place for religious experience. Do you notice that? God is simply a postulate. He must exist for everything else to work. There's no talk of needing God, of praying to God, of worshiping God. God is simply necessary. He's a necessary postulate for reason and for morality to work. That's not the way God seems to be encountered in the world as a necessary philosophical postulate. So we could ask, what does relationship with God actually mean if it's simply a postulate of pure reason that's necessary for my life to work? Why would I ever need to think about God, for example? Maybe that's just the job of a philosopher. Or third, then, doesn't it look like religion has suddenly become a necessary aspect of morality, or has become a form of morality, or a grounding of morality, a grounding of philosophy? Is there anything to religion besides simply being a form of morals? Many skeptics are going to say that's all that religion is, and we still hear that today. Send my kids to religious schools so they become good persons. I send them to church so they'll be good. Persons are thinking there's not really any reality to religion except for the formation of morals. It makes a person good. Is that all there is to religion? On Kant's account, it sounds suspiciously like that's the case. And so we're going to see a guy named Friedrich Schleiermacher, the first liberal theologian, trying to answer Kant and respond to him and show that there's something more to religion than simply a rational postulate that makes morality work. So let me just give a review then about these philosophers that we've looked at so far, and then we'll show where we're going. The first guy we looked at was David Hume, and Hume's great achievement was to bring on the thought of Immanuel Kant. But in himself, what Hume was arguing is that the law of causality is not very sure. It's not very certain. We can't really show cause and effect to always work together. And so what Hume wants to get at is that postulating God as first cause is a very dubious kind of a thing. And we should be very, very careful about doing that. We should be very skeptical of ourselves when we do that. Kant, on the other hand, wants to restore the probability of cause and effect. He says cause and effect work together because that's the structure of our mind. That's the way we see things happening. And so for Kant, even if we can't prove God's existence, and even if we have no empirical data of God's existence, just like noumena, we have to assume that God exists because we need God to be the ground of existence, and we need God to be the ground of our morality, the one who establishes the categorical imperative and makes sure that everything turns out right in the end. So religion then becomes equated with morality for Kant, practically. Next time, we'll talk about a guy named George Friedrich Hegel, probably the most influential and most important philosopher next to Kant in the 19th century. And his argument is that God is, in fact, developing along with human beings. And that's going to radically change the way that modern theologians think about God, think about humans, and think about the world in which we live.